Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Lost Voice radio program. This is Jacob Nelson along with John Studi, where we talk about philosophy and the lost voice of philosophy in our modern age, where we seek to discover the truth about our existence and bring it to just our everyday life. John, how are you doing this today?
Oh, I'm doing great. You know, we had an awesome conference. We had an Apologize conference at my parish where I work down in Bloomington, Minnesota. Invited a guy up named Dr. Scott M. Sullivan, who is a PhD from the St. Thomas Center for Thomistic Studies, and he runs his own ministry called Classical Theist. You can find his work on www.scotmsullivan.com. And he's got a lot of really good material on there about logic and the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas and Christian apologetics. A big part of what he does is he's really working hard to combat the rampant secularism that's continuing to grow in our own culture. And he is a great speaker. But we had a pretty big crowd, almost 200 people came, and that's a really successful event, in my opinion. It's the first time we've ever done anything like this in Nativity. Kids really seem to like it. What was your impression, Jake?
Yeah, I was there too. I gave one of the talks on the truth of the Catholic faith, and I thought it was really well received by the people there. I was impressed with the great number of people there as well. Of course, anytime you can get 200 youth together for an optional retreat, or an optional conference, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I think so too.
So I think it was very good, and I'm looking forward to the next conference that we can put together, together. The next couple weeks here on the Lost Voice radio program, we're going to be focusing on technology. Today, we're going to talk about Aristotelian logic. John and I came across a great article talking about how Aristotle actually kind of formed the basis for modern computers. So we're going to talk about that. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and modern technology. How can Thomas Aquinas inform our understanding and use of modern technologies? And then the week after that, so it'd be, 3 weeks from now, we're going to talk about Inter Mirifica, which is a great Vatican II document, the decree on the use of social media. I've found that document to be very prophetic. Not pathetic, but prophetic, because of how it talks about the use of social media, how we need to guard ourselves in certain ways, how we need to make sure that we're using the media and the technology before us in a good and holy way, a dignified way, and so much of that is lost in people today. But as far as today goes in Aristotelian logic and computers, John, why don't you lead us kind of in the premise here of what we're going about, and I use the word premise purposefully as we get into Aristotelian logic.
It's a bit of a pun there. Thank you very much, Jake. So with Aristotle wasn't the person to invent logic or to really think about how to use it. You see some of that in Plato as well as a few other.
Well, God invented logic.
Well, God invented logic in terms of
logic.
God is his own thinking,
yes.
His own essence, everything. Natural theology is great, divine simplicity, etc. But Aristotle was really the person who came around to really start formalizing it in a way that was systematic and really helped clarify how we already think and how to help us think better. Dr. Sullivan frequently talks about, who I spoke of earlier, talks about logic as mental jujitsu. And I like thinking about it that way quite a bit. Because,
he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu?
Oh, he's a secondary black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he is a 3-time world champ shoot boxing fighter out of Japan. And
that's incredible.
Oh, yeah, at the conference it was great. We did a little demonstration at the end where he showed some self-defense techniques and some jiu-jitsu techniques, and we talked about how that kind of relates into, we have to learn how to defend ourselves, and so we have to learn how to defend our bodies, and that guy, defend our faith as well. And that guy, he knows how to use his weight. It was crushing.
Well, not to take away from Dr. Sullivan, I mean, he has a PhD in philosophy from St. Thomas College or University down in Houston. But if that man is giving a talk and he asks if I agree with his logic, I'm just going to say yes.
Oh, of course you are. I mean, that's absolutely the case. I mean, he's intense.
I don't want to say no to him.
He is good, though. He's great. He gave one of the better presentations on the moral argument that I've ever seen. And that's actually one of my favorite go-to arguments for God's existence, which we'll be talking about logic a little bit here, so maybe I can give a demonstration of how you can show that God exists using logic. But with Dr. Sullivan, what I appreciate about him using kind of that analogy or that metaphor of martial arts and logic as being mental jujitsu is that, you know, if you like come up to somebody and you push them and you start fighting them, they're gonna do something, right? They're gonna swing, they're gonna try to choke you, they're gonna try to throw you down, they're gonna try to trip you, they're gonna try to defend themselves somehow. We all naturally have some sort of innate ability to fight. And some people are better at it than others, and I can tell you that from my own experience. I have been doing martial arts myself for, probably about 10 to 12 years here, and I've done mostly like stand-up kickboxing and karate, but I've also done quite a bit of jiu-jitsu as well in about the last year.
I'm somewhat larger than you.
Yes.
I mean, I'm 6'2", and you're what, like 5'1"?
5'1", yes, absolutely.
You're what, 5'10"?
About 5'10".
Yeah, so I'm 4 inches, and I probably have 20 pounds on you, and you throw me around like like I'm a pillow.
It's astounding, isn't it? And that was like what I really learned the first time I sat down and wrestled with the black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is just how pathetic you feel. And the guy, you know, I think at the time I was about 180 pounds, and this other guy, I think he's 5'6", 135 pounds, but it felt like I had a mountain on top of me, and I literally could not move him no matter what I did.
Yeah.
It was amazing. And the same thing with my stand-up experience as well. If you get somebody who's a really, really good striker, and you might think that you have some skills, but you can go on YouTube and find a street fighter going up against a 3-time world champion Muay Thai kickboxer, and holy cow, it's pathetic. You can laugh a little bit. In fact, I've done that with my friends before too, where I've like sparred and boxed with them a little bit, and it's astounding how slow people move when they don't have training because of how much they telegraph. But with logic, again, it's the same way. We all have some sort of ability to reason. We all have some sort of ability to make an argument, and some people are honestly just kind of naturally better at it than others.
True.
Through either biological disposition or if it's their own upbringing as well.
Yeah, I mean, formation plays a big part in it because part of logic is understanding your terms. I mean, you and I, whenever we give talks, kind of the main thing that we do is to define our terms. And that's what we've done on the radio show as well. But defining your terms, and it's really hard to form an argument or defeat an argument if you don't know your terminology. So I think a lot of it has to do with the formation of your mind, but also the formation of virtue, because if you're going to go into an argument, you should go into it for the right reasons, not just to be right.
Right. Yeah, precisely. And so, and it's that upbringing, it's that training that we have in defining our terms, which is the first act of the mind in Aristotelian logic, where you understand what you're actually starting to talk about. And as you continue to train yourself in the different acts, defining your terms or reason or apprehension, simple apprehension. Which is understanding what the words are.
Right. We talked about this last week.
We've talked about this last week, so don't need to necessarily go over it. But the more you train yourself in those things, the more skill you get in your mental jiu-jitsu. And I've found that with, I think Dr. Sullivan does a really good job of that, again, of giving these really cogent and coherent arguments. And so the fact that Aristotle came up with a very systematized method of learning how to reason correctly, I think does a great service for humanity, because we as rational creatures, our highest good, our highest faculty of our nature is in our capacity to reason. And by giving us logic, he's given us a way to be happier.
Well, it's true. Logic does, in fact, at least dispose us to greater happiness, because when we live in a well-ordered mind, a well-ordered, just society, then we can more properly receive what's necessary for our happiness. But if things are a mess, if our logical thinking, if the reasoning is all a mess, we're going to be thrown into chaos in our minds, and we're not going to be able to be happy in that way. So logic is one of the great ways that we are able to embrace happiness. And of course, Christ is the Logos. He's the Word, the logic of God. And so for us to be well disposed to right reason and well disposed to right logic, we're predisposing ourselves to receive that logic incarnate, which is Jesus Christ.
Right.
So of course, then we're happy.
Right. Which is we're made ultimately to be conformed to the image and likeness of God's Son. That's going to be the greatest good. That it's even beyond what's naturally possible for humans. I think that's the greatest thing about the Christian faith. And I love Aristotle, his Nicomachean Ethics, and he gives a great outline for how to live out a human life that will bring us a true natural happiness, a certain amount of eudaimonia. But what Christ gives us in his incarnation, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and us being united to him through faith and baptism, it's participation in the very divine life and bliss of the Trinity.
Right.
This is amazing. I just don't understand how people how anybody would want to be anything else once they understand that's what the high call of the Christian is supposed to be. And that's, I think C.S. Lewis said something great in his book Mere Christianity, that Christianity isn't necessarily about making bad men good, but it's about making dead men come alive.
Yeah.
And so in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of our supernatural divine life, we're dead. But what Christianity does for us, what Christ does for us, he makes us come alive. And that's why I love what you said there about logic and reasoning. The better we can strengthen our own nature, the more we dispose ourselves to being open to that divine life.
But I think part of the irony, he said, why would anybody want to be something different when we have the high call of Christianity to enter into the divine life of the Trinity? Well, this is all great, but kind of the irony is that it goes beyond human logic.
Yeah.
The supernatural call to participate in God's own life is not something that we can simply reason to. And that's why St. Thomas Aquinas says, over the course of many years, human reason alone can only get so far in its comprehension of God and come to know the one true God. And, Aristotle reasoned to one God before the revelation of Christ. And he himself, of course, was not Jewish at the time. He was Greek. But even he had an admixture of many errors, is what Aquinas would say about reason alone. And so, we need to have reason, but we also need to have faith, because God's reason is above our finite ability to know.
Right. But we get to participate in it.
We participate in it.
Yeah. Anything that doesn't. Yeah. No, not going to get into that.
So you came up with a great analogy as we were doing our show prep today. John came up with an awesome analogy about computers, because we're talking about, there's this article on The Atlantic, if you're familiar with that publication. John, who was the author? Chris Dixon?
Yes, Chris Dixon.
So Chris Dixon was the author of this article, and it's all about how Aristotle created the computer. Of course, he didn't create the actual computer, but Chris Dixon posits that Aristotle created the logic lying behind computer science.
Right.
And you came up with a great analogy here that in us making computers, we're participating in God's creative genius, because like God, we are teaching rocks how to think.
Right. Exactly. and now when we think as humans, our thinking is just wholly different from God's. In fact, we can't even say that God thinks, because he just knows.
He just is.
He just is. So he apprehends all truths in one act, and he understands things directly.
But you can't even really say he apprehends all truth, because he
is all truth. And he's the source of it. So, like when Thomas talks about God's knowledge in the Summa Contra Gentiles or the Summa Theologica, he talks about God's knowledge as him self-reflecting on himself, and knowing all things because he is the cause. So he knows what his power is capable of, and what his power has done, etc., etc. And so he knows all things through himself. And so that's not how we do it. We know a few things. We have the first principles, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, the law of identity.
So the law of non-contradiction is?
A thing can't be in the same way at the same time in the same respect.
Right.
Cannot be and be in the same way at the same time, same respect.
I personally like the law of identity. So just an object is what it is.
An object is what it is. It's not what it's not, right?
Right, and we come across these things all the time in our life, and we're like, well, duh, of course an object is what it is. That rock is obviously a rock, but yet there's people who deny this.
Sure.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And the non-contradiction, I actually use this in my talk at your conference about the truth of Catholic faith, that a thing both cannot be true and false, or a thing both cannot be and not be in the same way, at the same time, in the same place. And so my analogy is always that if you have a candle on your table, the candle can't be both lit and not lit at the same time. It can't both be on fire and not on fire at the same time. It wouldn't make any sense. And so Aristotle has these axioms that he uses to really, as you said, systematize our logical systems,
right?
To systematize how we think, so we can reflect on how we think.
Right, and that's actually I think moves into how this relates to computer science. So with Aristotle, his logic has often been divided into two categories, with formal logic and material logic. And material logic is the what the syllogism is about. And so if we throw the classical syllogism out there of all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore what?
Socrates is mortal.
Socrates is indeed mortal, and this is again how we normally think. And the material in there is the quantities that we're speaking of. We're talking about Socrates and mortality and men, and so these are the things that are making up the individual parts of the syllogism. But the formal logic is, well, it's nominative right there. You can understand what it means almost from hearing it. It is the form. It's the quality of the logical proposition or the logical syllogism. And that can be itself be abstracted. And so if we were to say all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal, we can symbolize. What am I doing? We can abstract it and put it into symbols. And the way that we do it in traditional logic would be saying something like all men are mortal, Socrates is man. All M is S, and then all P is M, and so you have the middle terms on both ends there, and then you have the subject and predicate term, and then in the end it's all S is P.
Right. So in the simple, because you're talking about the form of the syllogism, the form of the argument. So when we look at all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If you replace Socrates and mortal with anything else, the form is still valid.
Yep, the form is still valid, but important to remember the material logic also does have an effect in it.
Right.
So if you put in proper categories in there, say all like for instance, all men are mortal, the queen is not a man, therefore the queen is not immortal, you've done what? You've committed the a four-term fallacy, or you've even done like an equivocation.
But even more simply, if I say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, I can change up what is in there. The form is still valid.
Yeah.
But if my premises are not,
right,
then the conclusion won't be. So if I say I don't know, all fish swim. John Studi is a fish, therefore John swims. I mean, the conclusion still is true, but the premise was wrong.
Because I'm not a fish.
Because you're not I think you're not a fish.
As far as I understand, I'm not a fish. As to date, I've nearly drowned twice, and I can attest that I do not breathe water. So.
But you didn't drown, so maybe you are a fish?
That could be true, actually.
We should test this.
What? Waterboarding me?
No,
let's not do that.
There's no torture on our show.
No torture on our show, other than the people who are listening to it.
Yeah, it might be torture to listen to this. But anyway, the form still stands. But we need to understand that our premises need to be accurate as well.
Yes, and that's where if you look at the way Aristotelian logic is formed and assessed, you can talk about a valid argument, but you also need to talk about a sound argument. And the difference between a sound and a valid argument is that a valid argument is one which all the reasoning is true, so the form follows validly. It's correct. But a sound argument is one in which not only is the reasoning true, but so is the material. The material is material is true, so all the premises are true, and all the terms need to be clear as well.
Right. So you can have a valid but not sound argument.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And a sound argument will bring about a true conclusion.
Right.
So, whereas a valid argument necessarily doesn't. Doesn't necessarily bring about a true conclusion.
Right.
And now that's where people in later ages, in trying to adopt or further Aristotle's clarity with his logic, tried to come up with a more abstracted or a more mathematical form of logic.
So men like Boole and, William of Ockham.
Yep, William of Ockham started trying to put together a more mathematical form of logical reasoning. So did and Descartes. You can even look at Descartes a little bit, where he was very concerned about clear and distinct ideas.
Right. Descartes started from a position of doubt. Doubt everything.
Sure.
Because we can't. If we start from a position of doubt, then each thing we come across, we can analyze, we can take in, and as long as it's clear and clear and distinct? I forget his two.
Yeah, that's it.
Clear and distinct. As long as it's clear and distinct, then it will be true.
Right.
But he starts from a position of doubt. But a lot of people mistake Descartes for something that he wasn't. Descartes actually wanted to strengthen the faith by removing all doubt. Mm-hmm. The way he went about it was to start from doubt so that everything posited was actually true and valid. He went about it in a mathematical way. Descartes was a mathematician.
Yep.
But people think Descartes was, he just hated the faith, or he was an atheist or anything.
Oh, definitely not.
And he wasn't. He was trying to strengthen the faith. He started from a position of doubt. So, the ways he went about his argumentation, I don't think always quite worked for him.
It backfired.
Yeah,
it backfired real bad.
And we feel the effects of that today, of course.
We do. And I think part of what he was doing is, like, if you've ever done any work in physics, you'll notice there's a lot of mathematical equations, and these mathematical equations describe how material things work and how they tend to behave. And it's very clear and it's very distinct, especially once you understand the variables and the equations themselves. Mm-hmm. You can know things like Newton's laws of inertia, or the formula for force, or whatever it might be. And part of the success of modern physics is that it has been able to abstract those things from observing the matter. But there does get to be an issue where if you think of the universe simply as abstracted mathematics, and you're losing a lot of the truth of it.
Well, you get into scientism, where everything has to be quantifiable in order to be true.
Well, right. Well, even with that too, if you just keep the mathematical portions of your understanding of the cosmos, but you forget about the actual material which exhibits those mathematics, then you're having some issues. Like when people talk about Thomas's first way in motion, the first thing they always bring up is Newton's first law of motion. Mm-hmm. An object at rest tends to stay at rest, and thus or motion tends to stay motionless, acted upon by an outside force, and they think therefore Aquinas' principle that anything moved is moved by another is false, which is not true. They're aiming at different aspects of motion itself, and so there's no formal contradiction. And even within that, one of the things my professors at the Augustine Institute brought up about that was that the principle of inertia is purely abstracted, because there is no place in the universe where a thing is not going to be interacted with and acted upon.
True.
So when you take reality simply to be that abstracted understanding of how objects behave in an idealized way, then you're missing a part of the truth of things. And I think that's what happens with a little bit of modern physics, but it's also, I think, what's happened a little bit with modern logic, and we'll talk about that, I guess, in a minute or so here. But like Jake was saying, we were able to teach rocks how to think, but there's a difference with the way computers think is in terms of formal logic, whereas we have material logic. We understand the essences and natures of things. We get subjects and predicates. We understand that kind of stuff. We can abstract that. It's something that's a part of our natures. Whereas with with computers, it's purely like an on and off switch.
Right. So computer science, I'm not into computer science at all. I know very, very basic things about it all. But it's essentially a binary system where it's ones and zeros. And if a thing is yes, it's a 1. If it's a no, it's a 0. And it's a series of switches. And so, if the relay receives a 1, it opens. If it receives a 0, it closes and sends the signal off to another pathway. The form is fantastic in it, and I think that's what this author from The Atlantic was trying to get at, is that the formal logic within a computer is really similar in some ways to Aristotle, because Aristotle was kind of directing, let's say, the pathways of argumentation one way or the other based on the premises and conclusions. So you get to a conclusion like, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, that necessarily directs your conversation towards what is mortality versus what is divinity. So in one sense, the formal logic that computers have was founded by Socrates. But there's a huge difference, as you were saying, in that we're not just a series of yeses and nos in our own logic. We have things like existential import, which maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on. You tend to be a little more precise in philosophical matters. I tend to be a little more precise in theological matters.
Or things that matter.
Yeah.
Jake and I were talking about earlier. Like I'm really into the abstract and the speculative sciences, where Jake is concerned with, like, I don't know.
Why it matters.
People. Yeah, why it matters.
Why it matters to your life.
Why it matters to your life. I mean, I like that kind of stuff too, and I found some use in it. But we all got to go for.
Wait. You found some use in the practical?
Some use. I
think the definition of practical is that there is use.
Well, that's only because you are. I don't know. I was going to say something about me being an abstract intellect. Anyway, an abstract object. That's not the case. I am flesh and blood. In fact, as a redhead, I don't even have a soul, so therefore no form. So I am simply matter. So this is a very strange.
Just if you're listening, just disregard the last 30 seconds.
It doesn't even matter. No, we're fine. But before I get into the distinction about existential import, I just want to note about the computer real quick here. So we have people like Boole and Bertrand Russell and a whole host of other people who brought about a more mathematical way of thinking about logic and that science and the way we think. But in the in the 20th century, there was a master's degree, a person who was working as a master's degree. His name was Claude Shannon, and he wrote a master's thesis called A Symbolic Analysis of Switching and Relay Circuits. And what he did is he used this mathematical logic, this mathematical reasoning, and put together a board of like switches and electronic signals in a really haphazard way, because there was really no theory of how computational devices ought to work at the time. But he was able to make it, do calculations, which was just absolutely astonishing. And so that was the beginning of our computer sciences in a very.
So you're saying that he took a series, like the theory of switches, basically, overlaid Boole's logic on top of it, and now those switches kind of think on their own, so to speak.
Yeah, they think on their own. You give them the input, and because of the like you were saying, the yes or the no, because of the certain propositions, because of the form of what you put in there, it puts it through the process, and at the end comes out with the right answer.
Yeah, so I remember this actually in 8th grade advanced mathematics. We had the good old Texas Instruments TI-83 Plus calculator.
Absolutely.
And we had to write code in our calculators. So it was a lot of if blank, then blank. Mm-hmm. And so I was putting my logic, I was overlaying my logic as a human over the binary codes and switches that the calculator had. And so I was in essence giving my logic, my word to those things to then act on their own. So then when I hit the start button or enter button or whatever, my name would write across the screen because each pixel was an if-then statement, and so it would light up, and then once all of them would light up, it would flash and then turn off. But that was my logic saying, okay, if this thing happens, then this thing needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And so that was taking, I guess, I've never heard of this Claude Shannon guy before reading The Atlantic, but I was basically taking what he did in my 8th grade class, mm-hmm. and taking basically a bunch of switches that can say yes or no, and then adding my logic in, and poof, we have computer programming.
Right, exactly. And so when earlier we were talking about how we, in a way, participate in God's intelligence, he gave us his the power of reasoning and abstracting, and we now get to participate again in his creative force, or at least we get to imitate it by teaching a rock how to think. But just as God's way of thinking is qualitatively different than ours, so too this computer's way of thinking is also qualitatively different than ours. And the way that it is different is because of its existential import. The computer understands the semantics of how language works. It understands the form of how the logic works to actually bring about the right output from a certain kind of input, but what it's missing is the meaning. And to illustrate this, let me back up a little bit. And so, sometimes people are always asking the question, how intelligent does a computer have to be? How much does it need to compute in order to be considered a real artificial intelligence? And when does it get human rights? Well, the answer really is never. I mean, number one, because if it's a computer, even if it does somehow get to the point where it understands meaning, it's still not a human, so it doesn't have human rights, because rights are giving something what's due to it, and if it's a different kind of thing, then there's different things that are due to it. So, please, define your terms.
Computer rights. When do we get computer rights?
When do we get computer rights? Is that like on YouTube when you post something? And then
no, those are copyright rights.
Oh, copyright rights. Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Correct.
Great. Fantastic. Okay. And so I think it's ridiculous when people ask that question because, number one, they're making a category error because they're trying to bridge an infinite qualitative gap with successive quantitative steps. And quality and quantity are two different things. You can't do that. It's simply impossible. And so they're missing that as well. And I think that's one of the issues with modernism is that we see everything as simply quantitative, and then we're missing out this qualitative aspect of reality.
Right.
Difference. I think that'd be a great topic to talk about someday. In fact, I'm writing a paper on it. But a great illustration of what this all means is from John Searle, who posits this Chinese room experiment. And the idea is you have a guy, sit him down in a room with walls up, and you give him a dictionary of all the different Chinese characters, whether it be Mandarin or Cantonese, who cares, some sort of Chinese language. And you have people who are native Chinese speakers on one end, and then other Chinese speakers who are on the other end. And in the middle, you have the guy who's in this box who doesn't understand a lick of Chinese, not anything. And the dictionary has no English, has nothing that he actually understands, but only the different kanji not kanji, that's Japanese. What's the word again?
I have no idea.
That's fine. Why am I blanking on this? I know these things. That's the worst part. I know these things. But the different symbols for the different Chinese words, and he says he looks at the language, and this dictionary is just so complete that if he gets a symbol, he can find the symbol and then match it up with the proper response. And so people will come by and put some sort of question or some sort of statement into the box, and the man at some point gets so good at looking it up and popping it out and giving the right response that people have no idea that the person inside of it has absolutely no understanding of Chinese whatsoever.
Sure.
But because he's learned the semantics so well, he knows how to give the proper response. And this is something that is very analogous to computers, is that computers, they don't have that material logic aspect. They don't have that existential import of understanding exactly what the different terms mean and whether or not they're real or things that are actually associated in reality. They just have this input-output operation, which is different from what humans have. We, too, have the input-output operations, but our input and output are, in a way, dependent upon, first, our understanding of whether or not things exist in reality, or even what those things are in themselves. And so earlier we were talking about how if all fish are things that swim, and John Studi is a fish, therefore John Studi swims. In a computer, it'd say, yeah, valid argument, sounds great, John Studi's a fish, wonderful. But because you and I have an understanding of what we are, and what I am, and how terribly I actually swim, we know that, number one, I'm not a fish, and so it doesn't necessarily follow that I swim. But also from experience, and remember camp last year, I actually had to be taught how to swim. 28 years old, and I don't know how to swim. It's terrible.
Well, I'm not a great swimmer either, and I took lessons as a kid, but I basically sink like a brick, so I definitely am not a fish.
Well, I know. I was really happy. One of my kids is a great swimmer. She's done a lot for her school, and she taught me how to swim last year. It was very nice. Found out a few things I was doing wrong.
Yeah. Well, you bring this stuff up, and I was trying to find the video. There's a video on YouTube where this, I don't know exactly what he is, neuroscientist or something like that. And he's talking about actually mapping out an individual person's brain and every one of their synapses and connections, neurons, all of that stuff, and being able to actually upload that map into a computer. And he tries to explain this to 4 different people. So the first one is like an 8-year-old, and he explains it, and the 8-year-old gets it. And then it's a 13-year-old, and then it's a grad student, and then it's a psychologist. So he's trying to, it's an experiment to see if he can explain this really complex notion to 4 different levels of understanding. And he does a good job of it. But the thing of great interest is that he keeps asking the question of, will this computer have the same thinking as the human brain that's uploaded into it? I think it's a fascinating thing, but I think it goes back to what you're saying in that the computer would be able to perfectly mimic that brain.
Right, exactly.
But as soon as there's a new something that comes up to the computer, a new phenomena or whatever, the computer is not going to create the same new pathway that the human would. Because the human has that existential import, that ability to extract the substance of the thing that it's seeing. So when I see a tree, I can look at it and I can, to some degree, understand the treeness of it. But the computer looks at it and just says, tree. Doesn't know why, doesn't know the thing itself. And so the human brain has this capacity to see beyond simply the physical.
Right.
It sees the whole nature, so to speak.
It does, and even beyond that too. Aristotle in De Anima talks about the distinction between the passive and the active intellect. And the passive intellect is something which is acted upon. It receives forms, it receives impressions, and animals have some of that to an extent.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to learn. But what makes humans particularly different is our operation with those forms. We go beyond simple survival. Like, for instance, if there was a dog who had a bad encounter with a human, he might be afraid of all humans because he recognizes that these are generally more or less the same kind of thing. And so they make some sort of category, but it's not necessarily understanding the essence of it.
Right.
And he might even get better and realize it's only men with beards who've been bad to me, and so those are people I don't trust. What?
I have a beard.
Oh, I know.
I take care of dogs.
I know you do, but I'm terrified of you.
No, that's true. You are terrified.
Terrified.
Of me. Most of my kids at work are terrified of me.
Hey,
no, I'm kidding.
That's the only way to do youth ministry. Better to be feared than loved and respected.
Or as Michael Scott from The Office said, do I want to be feared or loved? I want people to love me so much they're afraid of it.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Or they're afraid of how much they love me.
Right.
Yeah.
But humans, what we do is we take these things, and the highest part of our nature is we don't simply have a practical end, a purely practical end for all of our reasoning, but the highest fulfillment of what we are stretches into the truth of things, the goodness of things, the beauty of things.
Yeah,
we get into being
the
itself.
Transcendentals,
yes.
Truth, goodness, and beauty, which are actually 2 of the 5 transcendentals. Beauty is not always considered one, but we can say it's. So I say 2 out of the 5 for those 3 terms, because beauty isn't always considered one. But yeah, we can dive into the truth, goodness, and beauty of a thing, which, that's one of the amazing things that makes us, in fact, human. At this point, I kind of want to switch tracks just slightly, because we have a point that we wanted to talk about as well, and we glanced over it a while back. And I think this gets more now into the practical application, because, again, I'm in the practical sciences, John's into the theoretical sciences. And I think from here on out, it's getting weird to call you John. I think from here on out, I just need to call you Studi.
That's fine.
So, John Studi or Jonathan Studi, he's gone by Studi his whole life.
2nd grade, at least.
So it's getting weird for me to be formal with him. So, listeners, it's Studi. Just now you know. But anyway, Studi and I were talking about this, and it kind of goes to this idea of computers not having existential import. They just see what's on the surface and can react in a yes or no way. I posit here that we've actually become more computer-like as we've sought to make computers more human-like. And I posit this because if we go back to the idea of Socratic logic, there's, in the classic syllogism of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Great. We have 2 premises, and we have the conclusion. Socrates is mortal. Now, I think what happens for most people today is that we don't have the premise in mind. We have the conclusions. And so I see somebody on the street, I'm driving my car, and they jump into the road, and I avoid it. I avoid the person, hopefully. I avoid them because I recognize immediately that they're mortal. They can die. I didn't think of, this creature in front of me is a certain kind of creature, and all creatures are mortal, therefore this thing can die. I'm not thinking in terms of those premises. What I'm immediately thinking of is the conclusion. Because our brains are so efficient that when we go to start thinking and analyzing things, we skip premises all the time. And if we look in our culture, we live in such a reactionary culture where people don't think about the premises, they only think of the conclusions. And I think a lot of this, we can talk about the news media and things in the news media, I think, is kind of an odd exception to this rule in the sense that they look at the premises, except I think a lot of the premises they have are false, or they produce false premises.
Or they have poor terms.
Or very poor terminology. One term that you brought up in the conference this past weekend is discrimination.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people were shocked to find out what discrimination actually means, because we think discrimination, this term, means that we have a necessary hatred for one group over the other.
Right.
So, John, discrimination.
With discrimination, so we often, like Jake was saying, it's almost equated with bigotry, but we discriminate all the time. If you were to look at me and Jake, you'd recognize that one of us is very good-looking and the other one is very, very ridiculously good-looking, and that one of us has red hair and one of us has jet black hair, although going gray because now,
Because I work with you.
Because you work with me. Actually, Jake's hair is not going gray.
It is.
Oh, it is? I haven't noticed. You're so young and virile looking. I don't know. Anyway, so we make discriminations all the time, and a discrimination isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a great thing. It's like when Jake was saying, if he did not discriminate between living and non-living things, then when he was barreling down the highway at breakneck speeds and there was a shopping cart to hit or a person to hit, then his choice ultimately wouldn't matter if he didn't actually discriminate.
And I would go even further and say it's not even that it could be good, but that it's necessary.
Oh, absolutely.
Our brains necessarily make distinctions all the time.
Yes.
All of our thinking is distinction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we talked about that in the first episode, actually, too.
Yeah, we probably did.
Yeah, we totally did, yeah. So we have to make these kind of divisions, but our divisions need to be based in reality, is what we were talking about before.
Right,
yeah, I remember that. And so Jake recognizes, as he's barreling down the highway at breakneck speeds, that there's a living thing, and if I hit that living thing, it's no longer going to be a living thing, so don't want to hit that guy right there. So if I have to choose between the two, then the best choice to make in this action of discrimination is to hit the shopping cart or whatever it might be. And so when we make a discrimination in terms of our thinking, it's a good thing. It's always great. But when it comes to our actions, I think that there can be ways to discriminate justly and unjustly, which is exactly what the Catechism says about people who have homosexual attractions. In Catechism, I think 2358, talks about how every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. And people are really confused about this. Why? Again, because...
Wait, so there can be a just discrimination?
There can be just discrimination, absolutely, positively. Because, again, justice is about what, Jake?
Justice is giving to another what is due to them.
Giving another what is due to them. And the way we understand what is due to somebody is an examination of what they are. So, like I was saying before with computers and human rights. Human rights and human computers and computer rights are going to be radically different because they have radically different things. It's not like we humans need water, and so putting water in my mouth and helping me drink and everything is just, it's good. It's going to result in my flourishing. It's going to be a good thing.
Unless you're swimming.
Unless I'm swimming, in which case, please save me. I don't know what I'm doing. But if I were to pour some water into the CD drive of my computer thinking it's going to help it out, I'm out $1,000. I mean, that's just all there is to it. I mean, well, actually, probably like $300. I have a garbage computer here, but it's not good for my computer to give it water. And so, when we make a just discrimination, what we're doing in terms of our actions, what we're doing is we are making a choice based on what this thing is, and saying yes or no, or giving it something what is due to it, or withholding something from it that is not due to it, which will be bad. And when it comes to our understanding of gay marriage in our culture, we recognize that what marriage is, because of it being a relationship, a sexual one, and the sexual act being for the sake of reproduction and unity and for the whole society, because a gay couple in their sexual act cannot, by their very nature, ever produce children, marriage is not rightly discriminated to them or given to them. And so we can make the discrimination between the act of two people who are the same sex, one to have a sexual relationship with each other, and saying, yeah, that can't be marriage, and then looking at a couple who is one male, one female coming together in a relationship, we can say that, yeah, that's a marriage right there, because it can still act for the sake of what marriage is for, whereas a homosexual couple simply cannot do that. Or we can even talk about, like, you have a man who is 6'4", a hulking, athletic, super intelligent. He wants to be a Navy SEAL. Great. It can be a just thing for him to do that. We can say that it's his right to become a Navy SEAL if he wants. But if we have a quadriplegic who is blind, then it would be unjust for us to let him become a Navy SEAL, because it's not going to be good for somebody who doesn't have arms and legs and can't see to be on the front lines in battle or doing all these special missions.
Right. Well, in the Navy SEALs, any branch of military, they have certain bars that people have to hit in their fitness in order to be a part of the platoon. You know, they
Sure.
can't just allow anybody to be on the front lines, because it's going to be a detriment to the other soldiers on the front lines. But there's one line in this article that I found rather fascinating, and the author is talking about the different axioms that we've spoken of. An object is what it is. No statement can be both true and false, and every statement is either true or false. He says these axioms weren't meant to describe how people actually think, because that would be in the realm of psychology, but how an idealized, perfectly rational person ought to think. And I think, because I am perfectly irrational in this case, I think. Anyway, I think what you're getting at here is that in order to justly discriminate or to make good distinctions, we have to understand how we ought to think. And so this ties in then, too, with what we were kind of coming from earlier, in that people aren't making good arguments anymore. They're focusing on conclusions, but those conclusions are based on their emotions a lot of times.
Right.
Donald Trump is evil. Well, what does it mean to be evil? Donald Trump is a monster. Well, what do we mean by monster? Because if the conclusion is that Donald Trump is a monster, then we have to look at the at least two premises that we have that we can come to that conclusion on.
Sure.
And a lot of people are just reactionary based on their emotions. I think one of the real common ones in Donald Trump's presidency is the whole idea of the travel ban. And if you look at the travel ban itself, and I'm not here defending Donald Trump, we're not in a political talk show, but I think this is a great example that, Donald Trump, he said some stupid things about the travel ban, but if you read the text itself, it was something that was temporary, and it was against certain nations where there's known to be terrorism bred against our nation, and this ban is actually in accord with part of the Constitution that says specifically that the president has the right to shut the borders for the sake of security.
Sure.
But what people were reacting to is, well, Donald Trump hates immigrants. Well, that wasn't it at all. It has nothing to do with...
His wife's an immigrant.
Yeah, his wife's an immigrant, for one, and it seems like they're in a loving, committed relationship. But he wasn't talking about immigrants there, and he's got other things that he said on immigration, but people equate all of his views on immigration to this one travel ban that was specifically for a temporary time period. And the other thing of great note is that things like the limit on refugees that Trump set at 50,000 has actually been the average norm since 2001.
Right.
The only aberration has been in 2000, I think it was 15, when Barack Obama raised that to like 90,000. But the amount of refugees we still had were about 50,000 even when that limit was raised.
Sure.
So people aren't looking at the premises, they're just jumping to some conclusion of, well, he's a monster because he hates all immigrants. Well, that's not it at all. And so people are looking at just their emotions as the premises, jumping to a conclusion. Now when we get into that line that this author, Chris Dixon, had, is the axioms that we described, they're not describing how people actually think, but how an idealized, perfectly rational person ought to think. And that word ought is of great note here, because ought signifies what one should do, how one should think.
Right.
That seems awfully restrictive for our culture.
Oh, yeah.
How you should act.
It's prescriptive.
Yeah.
How can you tell me what to do? And I think so a lot of times people who believe in in natural law theory, like Jake and I do, and as what's been adopted largely by the Catholic Church, is they say that there's the naturalistic fallacy. You can't derive an ought from an is. And I think that's absurd. And the reason for that is because, let's just drop it back to a non-moral example. An acorn, given what it is, ought to be what? Ought to become what?
I would say probably an oak tree.
Probably an oak tree.
Yeah.
Wow, would you look at that? An is from an ought from an is statement. There's no such thing as like a value that we're necessarily imposing upon things. We might have a different like order or hierarchy of values, but things in themselves come laden with natural things anyway come laden with a certain amount of value.
Well, so for instance, my wife and I are awaiting our first child.
Yay.
20 weeks along in the pregnancy, today actually. So she's human, my wife. I'm human, so I'm talking about what we are, or she is, I am. So does that mean that the thing growing in her womb is also an oak tree?
Obviously, it's an oak tree.
I believe it's going to be it ought to be a human. It
ought to be human. No. A friend of mine, I'm not going to say who, because she's pro-choice, but I thought this was a really funny statement, and this is another topic too, but somebody once asked her, "Oh, you're pregnant? What is it?" And then she's like, "It's a bunny! It's going to be a baby human. I mean, what else is it going to be?" And so it's just funny that people will ask that kind of question. Now, that's just a humorous response, but
I'm hoping for a Cadillac.
You're hoping for a Cadillac? You get a nice car. My poor dad, he had a I don't remember what year it was. We had like a 1967 Mustang or something like that. Nice classic car. But then me and my sister came along, so there goes that car. But when it comes to how we ought to act as humans, when we look at our natures, there's something that's distinctive about us, different from animals that we talked about before. And this is where the theoretical sciences help guide the practical sciences. Right. And if we as humans have as our highest end and our highest faculty reason, then that is what should govern all of our actions. Right. Insofar as I can, of course. It's a part of reason if we get into a situation where, you're going to have to choose between running a kid over or running a cart over, you're going to think automatically. Mm-hmm. You're going to move automatically. That's instinct. That's great, because that's right. Rationally where you ought to have that, because it'd be a bad decision for you to sit there and deliberate about whether or not to hit a child or a cart. I think it's obvious. But so when it comes to the statement here of him saying how an idealized, perfectly rational person ought to think, I really hope the author, and I'm not sure, I don't know much about Chris Dixon. Chris Dixon. I'm not sure where he comes from on these things, but I hope he doesn't mean that Aristotle is simply giving a prescription based off of his own opinions and how people ought to think, because then he's misunderstanding how Aristotle himself defines the way he thinks about rationality and thinks about logic. Right. Because Aristotle is saying that these first principles, the law of non-contradiction, law of identity, law of the excluded middle, these are features of the real world, and that we ought to conform our minds to the way reality actually is. And then after we've conformed our minds to the way reality actually is, only then can we start living a fully and completely actualized human life, a specifically human life, aimed with a specific, or moving with a specific human nature towards a specific human end, which is going to be a specific human good, and it's going to be a specific human happiness. We are made for a happiness higher than that of pigs. Right. We're made for something greater.
Yeah, and I think maybe the first little bit of time next week we can talk about this, because we're almost out of time here. But when we talk about how one ought to think, or what one should do, what we're really getting into is the idea of justice. Because if there is a should, it means that we're giving something to somebody or something what is due to them. Because the ought signifies there's a structure within we are acting, and that we are responsible to something or somebody higher. And so in 21st century America, the way we ought to act on our taxes is to be honest, to pay the government, though its debt is $20 trillion at this point. It'd be another fun thing to talk about. But, we ought to act a certain way towards our government and to be law-abiding citizens. But what happens when the human or conventional law goes against natural law or against divine law? And so when we start talking about how one ought to think, part of that is the formation of our understanding of justice. And we can't change the absoluteness of the laws of divine and natural. We can change the conditional laws of man, though, because we create our own laws all the time, which govern how we ought to act within a justly ordered society. Right. But those laws only work if they're in accord, or at least do not offend, the natural and divine laws. Right. So I think because logic is really a set of laws. If you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, logic of if this, then that, you're overlaying a law onto how you're thinking. Sure. Because it governs how you ought to think. An object is what it is. That's a law. It's a law by nature. You can't call, a piece of wood a fish. That's not what it is. Right. And so you're kind of putting a law over the way you're thinking. So I think it might be good to talk briefly about this next week as we get into St. Thomas Aquinas and technology, how we ought to be using it.
Yes, absolutely. Now, before we go here, talking about Dr. Scott Sullivan again, my first exposure to kind of a formalized and systematized understanding of logic was actually through his Logic 101 course, which I highly recommend. Hop right on board to scottmsullivan.com. Check out what he's got. Send him an email. Tell him I sent you. It's not going to get you anything, but tell him I say hi.
Might get Studi something. I don't know.
Maybe.
Might get him out of a headlock later.
Might get me out of a headlock later. Check out some YouTube. A little bit later, I'll post some of the little self-defense demonstration that we did at the conference. But yeah, so check out Dr. Sullivan's course on logic. It's one of the best out there, in my opinion. He's a very clear teacher. And with that, then you can even start learning your own self-defense, your own mental jujitsu, and not only learn how to argue better and reason better about the world, but it actually has a lot of practical consequences as well.
Yeah, a lot of those practical things we'll talk about more next week. We started getting into that at the end of this week, and so we'll continue that theme next week in April, already spring. So we'll talk about logic some more next week. We'll talk a little bit about justice, and we'll talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and how we ought to act in regards to technology.
All right. Again, this is the Lost Voice program, where we seek to recover the lost voice of common sense, which spoke to Socrates over 2,000 years ago in Athens. This is John Studi signing out, along with Jake Nelson. God bless, and we'll see you guys next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.